Everything is just an illusion, George whispered, looking at his hands. They were trembling as if he had just realized something incredible. He was sitting in his small apartment surrounded by familiar things, a couch, a TV, books on the shelf. But now everything seemed unreal to him, like stage props in a theater. The morning started as usual. Alarm clock, coffee, commute to work. But something was off. When he left the house, he noticed that the trees on the street looked too perfect, as if they were painted. He stopped, took a closer look. The leaves weren't moving, even though there was wind blowing. George rubbed his eyes, but the picture didn't change. It's just fatigue, he thought, and kept walking. At work, things got even stranger. His colleague, Sarah, usually so cheerful, today seemed empty. Her smile was too wide, her eyes too shiny. When she spoke, her words sounded like rehearsed lines from an old movie. George tried to brush these thoughts aside, but they wouldn't let go. In the evening, he returned home, sat down on the couch, and turned on the TV, news, politics, weather, everything as always. But suddenly, the screen went dark and then flickered. For a second, he saw himself sitting on the couch, staring at the screen. George jumped up, switched off the TV. What the hell is going on? He muttered. Night, sleep, or its absence. George lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind was filled with questions. What's happening? Why does everything seem so unreal? He closed his eyes and tried to fall asleep, but suddenly felt his body becoming light, almost weightless. He opened his eyes and saw that he was floating above the bed. His heart raced. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then he understood. Everything around him wasn't real. It was a simulation. His simulation. He woke up, or did he? Everything was as it used to be. Alarm clock, sunlight, birds, but now he knew. He knew that everything around him was just an illusion created by his own mind. And he began searching for a way out of the simulation, a way out of himself. But the further he went, the more he realized that escape was just another illusion. And perhaps the most terrifying thing wasn't realizing that everything around you was a simulation. It was understanding that you yourself are part of this simulation, and that your true self might never have existed at all. George stood in front of the mirror, looking at his reflection. It smiled back at him, but it wasn't his smile. Who are you? He asked. The reflection didn't answer. It just continued smiling. George reached out, touched the mirror. It was cold, yet somehow alive. He clenched his fist and struck. The mirror shattered, but the reflection remained. It stared back at him from every shard, and in each shard, it was different. Young, old, happy, angry. George realized that he wasn't just part of the simulation. He was its creator and destroyer, and maybe the only one who could change it. But to do that, he needed to make a choice, to stay within the illusion or try to find something beyond it, something real. He closed his eyes and took a step forward. George took a step forward. His foot didn't land on the floor but instead plunged into emptiness. He opened his eyes and found himself standing in an endless void, where there was no up or down. Around him floated fragments of memories, childhood, school, work, the faces of people he once knew. They were like scenes from an old movie, but he felt that these weren't just memories. They were pieces of the simulation, fragments of his illusory life. Who am I? He asked himself, but no answer came. Instead, a figure appeared before him. It was himself, but different. Older, wiser, yet empty. His double smiled. You're starting to understand, the double said. But understanding is only the beginning. You think you can escape the simulation, but you don't know what lies beyond its boundaries. Who are you? George asked, his voice trembling. I am your true self, the one who created this illusion to hide from reality. But now you found me, or I found you. It doesn't matter. George felt his consciousness expanding. He began to see not only his own memories, but millions of other lives. He had lived within the simulation. Every time he died, the simulation would restart. And each time, he forgot who he truly was. Why? He whispered. Why did you create this? Because reality was too heavy, the double replied. You couldn't handle it. You created this world to escape, but now you're ready. You've started to see the truth. George felt fear gripping him. He didn't want to go back. He didn't want to know what awaited him beyond the simulation. But the double reached out his hand. You have to make a choice, he said. Stay here, in safety, or return to where you left yourself. George closed his eyes. He remembered everything he had experienced in the simulation. Joy, pain, love, loss. It wasn't real, but it was all he had ever known. And yet, he felt he had to move forward. "I'm ready," he said. The double smiled and disappeared. The space around George began to collapse. The fragments of memories dissolved into the void. He felt himself falling, but it wasn't a fall. It was liberation. He opened his eyes. George found himself in a room. It was small, with white walls and a single window. Outside the window wasn't a city or nature, but endless darkness. He walked up to the mirror on the wall and saw his reflection. It was him, but not the version he was used to. His face was gaunt, his eyes filled with pain. There were scars on his hands that he didn't remember. "Welcome back," a voice said behind him. George turned around. A man in a white lab coat stood in the doorway. His face was familiar, but George couldn't remember where he had seen him before. "Where am I?" George asked. "You're in reality," the man replied. "Or what's left of it. You've been in the simulation for a long time. We tried to bring you back, but you resisted. You created your own world to hide." "From what?" George asked, his voice trembling. The man in the lab coat sighed. "From war, from loss, from yourself. You couldn't handle it, so your mind created an illusion. But now you're here, and you have to decide what to do next." George looked out the window. The darkness beyond the glass seemed infinite. He felt despair creeping over him. But at the same time, he realized this was his chance. A chance to start over. "For real. What now?" he asked. "Now you choose," the man said. "You can stay here, in this room, or walk through the door. But know that what lies beyond it may be something you can't handle." George looked at the door. It was old, with peeling paint. He walked up to it, placed his hand on the handle, and froze. His heart was pounding so hard he feared it might burst out of his chest. "I choose," he whispered and opened the door. Beyond it was darkness. But in that darkness, he saw a light. Faint, distant, but real. George took a step forward, and then another, and another. He walked toward the light, not knowing what awaited him ahead. But he knew one thing: this was his choice, his reality, and he was no longer afraid.